Clint Eastwood was deep in conversation with his crew on set, his usual intensity commanding the room. But when a young girl approached him, holding a teddy bear and asking a simple question, "What does God mean to you?" his response stunned everyone in the room, leaving them speechless. It wasn't the answer anyone expected. Clint Eastwood stood at the center of the bustling Hollywood set, the epitome of cool authority. The crew moved around him like clockwork, adjusting lights, setting up cameras, and rehearsing lines. His voice was calm yet commanding as he guided the actors through their scenes. The air was thick with the energy of a high-stakes production, but Clint was a man who thrived in it, his presence demanding respect. Ava, a small figure in the crowd, stood by her mother, who worked on the set. She was wide-eyed, taking in the enormity of the scene before her. The lights, the cameras, the actors moving through their roles, it was all so grand, yet she felt out of place in this world of grown-ups. Her small hands gripped the worn teddy bear, Mr. Fuzzy, his button eyes slightly loose from years of companionship. Ava watched Clint from a distance, a mix of awe and curiosity bubbling inside her. There was something about him, something powerful, that made her wonder, was this man someone who could understand the questions she had in her heart? Ava's thoughts drifted to a question that had been troubling her for weeks. Does God really listen to children's prayers? She had asked her mom countless times, but the answer never felt right. It wasn't until she saw Clint, this towering figure of strength and wisdom, that she wondered, maybe he knows. Maybe he can help me understand. During a brief lull between takes, Clint Eastwood stepped off to the side, his eyes scanning the set, as if taking in the grand scene he had helped orchestrate. The crew was busy with their tasks, but Ava stood off in the corner, her eyes locked on him. Her heart raced, her small hands gripping Mr. Fuzzy tighter as she watched him. Ava's mother was still caught up in the work, so Ava, despite her shyness, took a deep breath and walked toward Clint, her footsteps hesitant but determined. She stood there for a moment, feeling small, but the words she had been carrying for days were suddenly too heavy to ignore. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "does God really listen to children's prayers?" Clint paused mid-step, taken aback by the unexpected question. His usual gruff demeanor softened as he turned to look at the little girl standing in front of him. The question, simple yet profound, struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the quiet desperation behind her words. For a moment, Clint said nothing. The noise of the set seemed to fade into the background as he absorbed the weight of her inquiry. Then, crouching down so he was closer to her level, he replied in a low, thoughtful voice, "That's a big question for someone so small." He studied her for a moment longer before speaking again. "But I'll tell you this, when you ask something that matters, when your heart's in the right place, I think it's impossible for anyone, or anything, to ignore it." Ava shifted uncomfortably, her eyes looking down at Mr. Fuzzy. She had to speak, the words were already on the tip of her tongue. "I pray for my mom. She works 2 jobs, she's always so tired, and our home doesn't feel safe. I pray for God to help her, to help us. But sometimes I wonder if he even hears me." Her voice trembled, the uncertainty clear in her young words. "What if God doesn't answer my prayers?" Clint's eyes softened further as he listened, and he took a moment before responding. The weight of her question, so raw and honest, tugged at something inside him. He didn't have an immediate answer, but what he did know was that this child, with her simple faith, had just reminded him of something he hadn't considered in a long time. "Well," he said, slowly and gently, "maybe the answers don't always come in the ways we expect. But that doesn't mean they're not there. Sometimes they come through other people, through acts of kindness or strength or love. And sometimes they come when we least expect them. But you've got to keep believing." Ava looked up at him, her face still uncertain but slowly beginning to soften. The sincerity in his voice had given her a flicker of hope. "So, you think God hears me, even if I can't see it?" she asked, her voice small. Clint nodded, his expression kind yet serious. "I do. I think he hears you, Ava. And sometimes just asking the question is enough to start the change. You're not alone in this." Clint Eastwood sat down beside Ava, his rough exterior softened by the warmth of the moment. The set was still alive with activity, but for Clint, it felt like time had slowed down. He could sense the weight of Ava's question, and for the first time that day the typical world of movie-making faded into the background. Ava, still holding Mr. Fuzzy, sat quietly waiting for Clint to speak. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. There was a depth to her innocence, a longing for understanding that reminded him of a time long ago, when he too had been filled with doubts. Clint leaned back, his gaze turning inward as he reflected. When I was your age, I had a lot of questions about faith. I grew up in a time and place where it wasn't always easy to believe in what we couldn't see. Like you, I wondered if God was really listening, if prayers even mattered. Ava watched him closely, her eyes wide, hanging on to his every word. Clint's voice was low, but there was a sincerity in it that she hadn't expected. I remember a time when I felt abandoned, he continued, his eyes distant as he relived the memory. I was struggling, and no matter how much I prayed, I didn't feel like anyone was hearing me. There were nights when I thought, why bother praying? Why even believe? He paused, looking at Ava with a soft but firm expression. But, in hindsight, those were the moments that shaped me the most. The unanswered prayers, the doubts, the times I felt like I was standing alone. They weren't the end of the story. They were part of the journey. Sometimes, God doesn't give you the answers you want right away, but that doesn't mean He's not listening. Sometimes, the waiting, the uncertainty, it all teaches you something you wouldn't learn any other way. Ava looked down at her teddy bear, her little fingers brushing against the loose button on Mr. Fuzzy's eye. She had never heard an adult talk like this before, so openly about doubt and faith, about not knowing all the answers. For a moment she felt a small weight lift off her chest. Maybe she wasn't the only one who didn't have it all figured out. Clint smiled gently, leaning a little closer. I know it's hard, but you've got to keep your faith even when you don't understand it all. You're on the right path, Ava. Asking questions, wondering about God, that's a good thing. And even if the answers don't come right away or in the way you expect, trust that they will come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will come. Ava's heart felt a little lighter, a little more hopeful. Clint Eastwood, the man who had directed so many movies, lived through so many struggles, had once been just like her. Unsure, questioning, trying to find his way. Just remember, Clint added, his voice soft but certain, sometimes faith isn't about having everything figured out right now. Sometimes it's about trusting that the answers are out there, waiting for you even if you can't see them yet. Ava nodded slowly, her eyes meeting Clint's. She still had a lot of questions, but in that moment she felt something she hadn't felt before, peace. Maybe it was okay not to have all the answers. Maybe the journey was what mattered most. Ava sat quietly beside Clint, his words swirling in her mind. As he spoke, something inside her started to shift. She blinked back tears, not because she was sad, but because she felt something she hadn't felt before, a deep understanding. Clint had told her that it was okay to not have all the answers, that sometimes faith was about trusting even when you didn't see the way forward. And in that moment, she realized that God was listening to her prayers, even if the answers weren't always what she expected. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of doubt or frustration. They were tears of relief, of understanding. Maybe she didn't need everything to be perfect. Maybe it was okay to wait, to trust, and to believe even when the road ahead was unclear. Clint noticed the change in her expression and, with a gentle smile, reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, worn object and handed it to her. It was a small piece of metal, perhaps part of a prop from the film, but to Ava, it felt like more than just a trinket. Clint's gesture felt like a symbol, something to remind her of their conversation, a token to keep her grounded in her faith. This is for you, Clint said softly. Keep it as a reminder that your faith is strong, even when it's hard to see the answers. It's okay to keep believing. Ava took the object in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it. She looked up at Clint, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. I'll keep believing even if it's hard sometimes. Clint nodded, his eyes kind but firm. You're stronger than you know, Ava. Keep that faith close to your heart. As she held the small object in her hand, Ava felt a connection that went beyond words. It was as if, in that moment, she had found a new sense of peace, knowing that her prayers were heard and that she didn't have to have all the answers. She would keep believing even on the days when it felt hard. And she knew with a quiet certainty that it was enough. As Ava walked away from Clint, she felt lighter. It wasn't the weight of doubt that had carried her before, but a sense of peace. Clint's words had planted a seed in her heart, a small but powerful reminder that faith wasn't about having all the answers immediately. Sometimes it was about trusting when things didn't make sense, holding on to belief even when the results weren't clear. Ava hadn't walked away with a concrete answer to her question, but something more valuable, the courage to keep believing even when the road ahead was uncertain. She glanced down at the small, worn object Clint had given her. It felt like a symbol of the faith she was holding on to, something to remind her of that conversation. Something to carry with her when the days felt too heavy, or when doubt crept in. She knew that God might not always answer in ways she expected, but she also knew that her prayers were heard. Clint watched her walk away, a rare warmth in his gaze. His usual hard exterior had softened in the quiet moments they'd shared, and for the first time in a long while, he realized that moments like this, small, unspoken moments, could change a person's life forever. It was easy to forget the power of simple things when you were always surrounded by the noise of fame and work. But seeing Ava's pure, unwavering faith had reminded him of something important. Faith didn't need to be complicated. Sometimes, it was as simple as believing even when you didn't have all the answers. Ava made her way to a quiet corner of the set, her heart still racing from the conversation. She sat down, pulling out her journal and opening it to the next blank page. Her thoughts swirled, but there was a sense of calm settling in her chest. She picked up her pen, the words flowing easily as she reflected on everything Clint had said. "It's okay to question," she wrote. "It's okay to wonder. God doesn't mind when we ask for answers, but He also doesn't always give them right away. Maybe He wants us to trust, to keep believing even when we don't understand why things happen. I thought faith meant getting answers, but maybe it's more about keeping the hope alive, even when we can't see the way forward. And maybe, just maybe, that's what faith really is." She paused, looking down at her words. For the first time, she understood that faith wasn't about certainty. It wasn't about knowing exactly what would happen next or having all the pieces fall into place. It was about trust. It was about continuing to walk forward, even in the dark, even when the answers weren't clear. Ava smiled softly as she wrote one last line in her journal. "God does listen. He listens even when we don't hear Him. And He's with us every step of the way." With that, she closed her journal, tucking it safely into her bag. The weight she had been carrying for so long felt just a little bit lighter. She didn't need to know everything. All she had to do was keep believing, keep praying. And that was enough. Ava stood up and looked around the set one last time. Clint was still there, talking with the crew, his strong presence ever the center of attention. But to her, he was no longer just the famous director. He was someone who had shared something real, something profound, something that had helped her more than he would ever know. She walked past him quietly, her heart full of gratitude, knowing that her faith had been strengthened in a way she hadn't expected. As the day wore on, Ava carried Clint's words with her. She walked through the bustling set, past the busy crew, and out into the world with a quiet sense of peace. She knew her faith wouldn't be perfect. There would still be moments of doubt. But she was ready to face them, ready to believe, even when things didn't make sense. Ava smiled to herself. She might not have all the answers, but she had something far more powerful: trust. And that, she knew, was enough. That night, as Ava settled into bed, the quiet of the room wrapped around her like a soft blanket. Her mother had already kissed her good night, and the world outside was still. But Ava's mind was far from still. The events of the day, the unexpected conversation with Clint Eastwood, kept swirling in her thoughts. She sat up in bed, her teddy bear Mr. Fuzzy resting beside her, and for the first time she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She closed her eyes, ready to say her nightly prayer, but tonight felt different. There was something new in her heart, a new understanding, a new kind of trust that had been planted deep within her. She hadn't received an immediate answer to her question, but she had received something far more meaningful, a shift in perspective. As she whispered her usual words to God, she added something new. "Thank you, God, for hearing me even when I don't hear you. And thank you for people like Mr. Eastwood, who help us see what we can't always understand." Ava's voice trembled slightly, not out of sadness, but out of a realization that had settled in her heart. Faith wasn't about having all the answers right now. It was about trust. It was about knowing that even when she didn't understand, she wasn't alone. She let the words linger in the quiet of the room. "Thank you, God," she repeated, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you for helping me believe even when it's hard." With that, she tucked herself under her blankets and closed her eyes, the weight of her prayer lifting her spirit. She didn't know how the answers to her prayers would come, but she knew with a certainty she hadn't felt before, that they would come in their own time. For now, that was enough. Meanwhile, as Clint Eastwood wrapped up his day on set, the usual hustle and bustle of the crew preparing for the next scene filled the air. But for Clint, something felt different. As the evening faded and he prepared to leave for the night, he found himself thinking back to the conversation with Ava. He wasn't one to dwell on matters of faith, not publicly at least. He had spent most of his life focused on the work, the films, the projects, the people. He wasn't someone who typically shared personal reflections with anyone, especially not a young girl who had come to him with a simple but profound question. Yet there was something about Ava's sincerity, her unwavering belief in something greater, that had touched him deeply. Clint sat in his trailer for a moment, the set outside still alive with activity. He leaned back in his chair, his mind wandering back to the words Ava had shared, her questions that came from a place of pure curiosity. The innocence in her voice had caught him off guard. She wasn't asking for a grand theological debate, she was asking about something real, something that had been troubling her for a long time. Did God really listen to her prayers? In that moment, Clint had done something he hadn't done in a long time. He had shared a piece of himself. It had been a rare vulnerability for him, but something about Ava's question had made him realize how important it was to be open with others, to share not just the answers, but the uncertainties, the doubts, and the lessons learned through experience. He thought about his own childhood, his own struggles with faith, and how often he had questioned what he believed. It hadn't always been easy for him, and it certainly hadn't been clear. But as he'd grown older, he'd come to understand that faith wasn't always about having all the answers. Sometimes, it was about holding on even when the road ahead was foggy and uncertain. Clint thought back to the look in Ava's eyes as she processed what he had said. It was the kind of look that showed someone was truly listening, truly thinking. For just a moment he felt a shift in himself, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful answers come not in the form of clear-cut solutions, but in the moments where we allow ourselves to question, to be vulnerable, and to trust. As Clint closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, he reflected on how rare and beautiful those moments could be. His life had been filled with action, with the noise of filmmaking and the demands of his career. But sometimes he thought the most powerful things happen quietly, when you least expect them. When you open yourself up to someone else's question, to their vulnerability, and realize that the answers might not be as important as the conversation itself. It was a thought that lingered with him as he prepared to head home for the night. Maybe, just maybe, it was those small, unexpected moments like the one he'd shared with Ava, that made the biggest impact. He couldn't help but smile to himself, a rare and genuine smile that had been absent for a long time. He'd always believed in the power of storytelling, but now he saw that sometimes, the best stories weren't always the ones on screen. Sometimes they were the ones that played out quietly, in the moments we least expected. And that, Clint thought, was a story worth remembering.